Next speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Sue Christie from Northern Ireland Environment in Belfast. And we're switching now from bats to turtles. And just as I didn't want any remarks about bat women, I don't want any remarks about teenage mutant turtles and all the rest of it. So as soon as Sue is ready to go, she will introduce herself, but she's a head of one of those Quangos, non-governmental.
There's a good. Well, if you're just standing there,
I can just hang up to it. Okay.
So it's straight forward and
Professor Sue Christie, thanks very much.
easy up and down, left and right buttons.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much, Terry. Terry asked me to give this talk about a year ago when we were at one of a conference that I was running. So I am not an expert in night sky astronomy. I'm a bit of an ecologist, so what I'd like to do today is to take you through some of the ways that light does impact on animals, plants, and ecosystems as a whole. You've heard one very detailed report of what it does to one species. I'm going to take a step back and look at a little bit broader picture. We're going to start with the sea turtle. Sea turtles, there's about 4 or 5 major species of them. They range from large to enormous. And they are probably the iconic species of a problem of light on their ecology and impacts that are having serious impacts on their numbers throughout the world. So leatherback on the beach, they all have to come to land to lay their eggs. They live their entire lives out to sea, but they have to come to land to breed. Many of the places where they come to land to breed are holiday resorts. They are largely in the tropics. They are very specific. Just like salmon come back to the same stretch of stream where they hatched, turtles go back to the same stretch of beach where they were hatched. If you have a serious impact on a breeding beach, you can have a very serious impact on a population and even upon a whole species. These little tots are rather tiny. They hatch out as at least as a whole nest, which can be up to 30, 40, 50 of them, sometimes more, and they immediately have to make their way to the sea. If they make their way to the sea in the early morning and before it's light, which is the best time, they struggle up through the sand and then puddle down the beach. They can get to the beach before it gets light. Obviously, the pictures aren't going to be before then for obvious reasons. And out to sea and hopefully avoid some of their predators. However, if they are on the beach when during daylight, they can be subjected to massive predation by gulls and other birds. And this is one of the really big problems. The second big problem is that the poor little things come out of their sand at night and they look around, and the way that they know which direction they're supposed to go to the sea is because of the light glow over the ocean. It's lighter than over land. So they immediately head towards the light. Now, that's grand if there's no other light around and you're heading to the ocean, but what is happening increasingly is that there's actually land-based light from resorts, et cetera, et cetera. So instead of going out to sea, getting in the ocean, swimming away, they're actually going backwards, going up the beach, and it's only later when the sun rises that they realize they've had a mistake, go back, and by that stage, they're toast. So that is just one example. You've heard the bat example as well. What is the extent of the problem? And I'm afraid that a lot of this I'm going to whip through it pretty rapidly because you've heard a lot of it already this morning. We're talking about 62% of the USA and 85% of the EU, and on a global basis, an astonishing 20% that is subject to artificial brightness above 10% of natural levels. We just don't know what the impacts are on species or on ecological communities. Some of the light also that is having this impact, we as human beings cannot detect, but animals and plants can, and they therefore respond to it in different ways. Basically, the issue is we just don't know. Artificial light has many, many, many effects. It disrupts physiology, especially rhythms, daily, monthly, annual rhythms. And that can be when something breeds, it can be when it flies like the bats, it can be when it's active. Light during dark phase is particularly disruptive to plants. It disrupts hormone production and is also especially of melatonin and prolactin. And this has unknown effects, hasn't been studied yet. Most of this work that has been done on light impacts on ecological communities, on species, has really been taking place in the last 10 years. It is not a mature subject. Aside from physiological disruptions, it also alters behavior. Light can attract or repel with impacts on feeding, migration, reproduction, communication, almost anything that animals do. It can disorient them. Another big problem with cities and migrating birds is that the birds get into the city, they don't know how to get out of the light cones. They just fly around. They fly into buildings. They exhaust themselves. They disrupt. They die. They can't continue on. They're subject to predation. Light is crucial to reproduction. Therefore, light at the wrong times, in the wrong amounts, disrupts behavior related to reproduction. And that, again, is across wide ranges of animals and plants, mayflies, ants, and squid, also mammals and birds, and communication. A lot of species use light to communicate, not just as we communicate when it is light and therefore not when it is dark, but also like animals such as fireflies and glowworms and deep-sea fish, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So it also increases predation risk. Bats use the light to feed, well, maybe, but the mercury vapor lights actually disrupt the moth-bat interaction because of the noise they send off. Small mammals feed less when it's lighter to avoid predators. Therefore, they have less of a time period during which they can feed. This may not be too important for something like mice. It can be absolutely crucial for something like shrews or bats, which need all the time available in order just to get enough food to survive. Zooplankters, which you probably don't think of too often, migrate in the water column up and down with light day and night. What happens with that? There's probably increased predation, especially because the animals that feed on them are more active during light periods. And finally, the biggie, ecosystem impacts on competition and predation and system impacts where you've got different resources. Going back to the bats, Emma mentioned that they partition the resource. That happens at a long range of areas, not just among bats. And you certainly find diurnal species, because of the light, being able to invade nocturnal niches. This can be summarized as unnatural selection. We're starting to put selection pressure on animals and plants that is new and unusual. I think we've been through this, the different types of light pollution, all of these different things. The one I'd like to point out are the two at the bottom. Flares on hydrocarbon platforms, which are really was delightfully described as birds finding the light, the night migrants seeing the light, going towards it and incinerating themselves, which is you're talking gannets and all the beautiful big birds that stay on the wing all their lives. And the lights on undersea research vessels, which are disrupting the behavior of deep-sea animals, many of which communicate with light. Plants and animals have been evolving for many millions of years. They are very finely tuned to the light levels in their environment, the types of light, the periodicity of it. We're messing with that. In the last 100 years, we've thrown in a whole nother factor. And 100 years is very little time for evolution to take place. And most of us in Northern Ireland do believe that evolution has been going on for several million years, not just 6,000. We do have a substantial minority, including our Minister of the Environment, who thinks it's only been going for 6,000. But to each his own, it's better than denying climate change. Sorry, I mostly play with politicians in the very trying to influence aspect. We have a bias when we look at animals. Most ecological work is done in daylight. We have some dedicated scientists who do work on nocturnal species, but most of our work is done in the daylight. Now that can be on diurnal species or it can even be on nocturnal species where we try and introduce an artificial daylight. We tend to look at what we can see. So we don't think about light in other spectra, and that is very important for everything from honeybees to bats, which rely on auditory stimuli, et cetera, et cetera. There's all of this other stuff going on out there, but we are restricted in terms of most of our observations of ecological communities to this relatively restricted level that we actually deal with. Most of the specific work that involves nocturnal behavior is done on a specific species. We look at lions at night because that's when they're doing their predation. If you just look at lions during the daytime, you'd think they never did anything but sleep. Mostly they don't do anything but sleep, but they do occasionally get active and kill things. The data are spotty, and it's usually sort of auxiliary. It's only recently that research has started really honing in on this aspect. And as with chemical pollutants, we may not even know there's an effect until after the damage has been done to the species, to the ecological community. I'd also like to say here that as part of the bias, there's been a lot of talk of fear of crime. People are afraid of the dark. Now, this makes a heck of a lot of sense. Diurnal mammals are afraid of the dark because that's when the predators are out there. I've recently gotten a little flock of new friends, and chickens. And in the daylight, they will come and they will eat out of my hand, but, I don't reach out and pet them. They fly away. They are not approachable. At nighttime, you can walk up to them and you can pick them up, and were I so inclined, I could probably eat them. I'm not so inclined. A fox is. And this happens even when the light levels are only a little bit darker than daylight. So we're starting to mess around with that sort of thing. And that happens, obviously, they're a highly artificially selected species, but it happens with natural species as well. We really need to look at what our impacts are. I'm now going to run through very rapidly a bunch of different sorts of critters and the impacts that we can have. I don't think I'll talk much more about mammals, except to mention that we do end up with more mammals going onto roads, either for feeding in the case of predators, or just wandering across it in the case of animals like this little critter. Birds, I've talked about a little bit. The light is a terrible disruptor to the night migrants especially. And it is really quite disruptive. You think, a few birds fly into buildings. It's actually not a few birds. It's thousands. It is an awful lot of them, both into lighted buildings and into buildings in the daylight because of the windows. They see the reflections in it. Reptiles and amphibians, there's been a fair bit of research done on amphibians, very little on reptiles beyond the turtles, but they do find that in the research that has been done, that there are definite impacts on physiology, behavior, and on development, which is an interesting aspect as well. If you don't develop well, if you don't develop quickly enough, you don't survive. My favorite comment on fish was brought to me just a couple days ago by one of my staff who saw something that great white sharks were using the fact that there were city lights lighting up the oceans to herd seals in together and eat them. Now, you expect that from killer whales. You don't necessarily expect that from great white sharks. But if you can get beyond the big teeth, they are really fascinating creatures. All sharks are. Invertebrates, we tend maybe not to think about them so often, but they are hugely influenced by light. The obvious one of mortality around lights, but it also upsets their migration routes. And as I mentioned before, the zooplanktons and other aquatic invertebrates can disrupt behavior. Squid particularly, well, I shouldn't say that. Squid, I am particularly familiar with because I think they're really great animals, are very responsive to light. They use it for communication, but they also use it for activity levels, and it can increase their predation, their risk of predation by other animals, but also by fishing boats. Fishing boats use light to attract them, and it can disrupt their mating behavior. Plants affected by light? Oh, yeah. In one plant species it was studied, which means that it's probably much more general than this, there were 11 different photoreceptors. And it affects just about everything you can think of that applies to plants. And plants are the basis of almost all of all terrestrial ecosystems. Therefore, the impacts on that can be massive. Hasn't been studied a lot, but we are probably talking significant impacts on pollination, interactions, and the ability of plants and animals to maintain their coordination. It desynchronizes mating activities, it disrupts migrations, it alters nest and breeding site selection. It can disorient them, it can kill them. We just don't know what all the impacts are. But they're not likely to be generally positive. If we've got something that's been evolving for several million years to be in a coordinated fashion, and we're all of a sudden throwing additional light on the subject, we don't know what's happening. It's not likely to be good. I now want to talk about the second big environmental impact of light pollution. And this is where my main work is at the moment in climate change and trying to raise action on it. That's a graph of the last 650,000 years. You can see the magnitude of the change that we are having. I think most of us have gotten beyond the idea of denying it or trying to avoid it, but we still don't know quite how to deal with it. A slight diversion into Northern Ireland, and I know it's boring, but I want you specifically to look at Northern Ireland here, between the two. Northern Ireland is generally still quite a rural society. I will assume that you can remember that one. And, oh my goodness, that's got a little bit wonky. But the relevant thing is, somebody earlier was saying that the level of brightness in England has increased by a massive 24%, 50% in Northern Ireland. It's really bad here because we are so fond of our big statement houses on the hill with the lighting and the general lack of planning structures in the countryside. Street lighting is as elsewhere, but possibly more so. It's a large cost in terms of energy, it's a large cost in terms of money, and it's a large cost in terms of CO2. Addressing it can help us to address several of the major problems impacting upon Northern Ireland in terms of strategic stuff, climate change, strategic energy framework, sustainable development strategy, etc., etc. Okay? Now I'm going to pop through things at an incredible rate of time because we've had it already this morning. Italy tried a behavioral change. It instituted daylight savings time and saved 644,904 million kilowatts simply by changing 1 hour. LED streetlights, we've heard more than I know, 10 times more. I know 10 times more about LED streetlights now than I did 2 hours ago or 3 hours ago, but I still don't know anywhere near as much as what's going on as what the rest of you do. There's an opportunity here, but we've got to be careful because we don't know what can happen. There's the opportunity for powering them by renewables as well, and that also has been mentioned. The intelligent lighting, I was fascinated to hear how far along we are with that. In the European Union, if we upgraded to the latest tech solutions, the running cost would save 4 billion euros and 8 million tons of carbon. Is it not worth it? It's a no-brainer. We're just beginning to discover the environmental effects of light pollution. We don't know what the ecological impacts are, but they could very well be serious. The opportunity to save money is significant, and the contribution to carbon reduction is important. All of that together means we really need to address the issue. So what is the solution? First of all, most of our politicians, probably all of them, possibly with the exception of the one who was here earlier, would say they hadn't even thought of the problem. Ignorance is not an excuse, and ignoring the issue will not solve it. We've got to address it, deal with it, and come up with a solution. That will involve changing our priorities in terms of thinking of others, in terms of climate change in far different places, distant places, in terms of other animals, in terms of other plants, in terms of the ecosystems. We need to think in the longer term, not what just is going to get us through the next day. We need to change our behavior in response to those priorities. And we need to realize that technology has many, many, many answers. And we need to invest in that technology in order to save carbon and to save money in the longer term. The difficulty there is knowing which is the right horse to back. Is LED the right horse to back? What kind of LED is the right horse to back? Is intelligent designed systems the best way to respond? I would think it probably is a major one, and I'm absolutely heartened to hear that we're so far along the way with it. But I do know that there's a lot of resistance in Northern Ireland to upgrading the grid in terms of allowing renewable contribution. Is there not going to be a similar political resistance in using this sort of intelligent street lighting and really getting into people's houses? I mean, I have a feeling that somebody could work the sort of thing that Sean was saying into quite a scary scenario for the average person. We know what you're doing. Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Good questions. Thank you.
When I first invited Sue to give this presentation, I don't know very much about this. She certainly learned a lot. That's an extremely comprehensive overview of all the ecological and indeed environmental and energy aspects of the problem. Now, we are running late still, so just a few very quick questions. At the back there, please. Yes, Connie. Oh, sorry. Yes, I am blinded.
Yeah. Difficult to say how we would bar influences of man. They've got big problems in terms of eating plastics. Now, that's definitely a problem with humans. They're subject to pollution, et cetera, et cetera. Now, on average, presumably, two turtles during the lifetime of an adult will make it to adulthood. Each female, each time she breeds, could lay 20 to 50 to 100 eggs, again, depending on the species. It's not impossible that you are talking about 100 eggs to one adult breeder. But then if you add in a few extra things like plastics, like additional predation on the youngsters, so that instead of, say, 5 babies out of each nest getting to the sea, and then, they have to run the gamut. If only one baby or no babies that year gets to the sea. Yeah, life's tough out there in the real world as well as what people are doing.
So our interaction with them is based on already
Predation risk, yeah. They start, they end up enormous, but they start out literally that size. It's a nice morsel for an awful lot of fish.
Okay, if there are more, I'll just ask you to thank Sue for a very informative